Broken Bonds. A Paranormal Protector Tale. Book 2 in the Heart of Stone series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 1. Anemone dusted off her hands. All right, that should do it. 48 hours of electrolytic reduction, and by Monday afternoon, those tools will look as new as the day they were forged in the prison smithy. Beth laughed. Or the day they were discarded, if they're ones that came with the convicts from England. The tools they made were pretty crude, but still a damn sight better than the ones they were supplied with. It's a wonder those convicts built anything at all, let alone half of Perth and Fremantle. Anemone shrugged. Tracing the history of things is your job, or one of the archaeologists'. I'm just a chemist moonlighting as a museum curator. Little more than a glorified dishwasher, really. Aha, sure, Dr. Seaver. Last time I checked, you don't get PhDs for dishwashing. Boat washing, Anemone corrected her. I did my PhD on marine corrosion on boats. Which is where she'd met Morgan and first been dazzled by his smile. Her heart constricted in her chest. She'd never see him smile like that again. How are the kittens going? Anemone blinked, all the way back to the present and Beth's sympathetic smile. Kittens. Yes. They've grown a lot now, big enough to leave their mum. The shelter's sending over some prospective adopters this afternoon, so I should probably get home before they arrive. Beth's eyes turned misty. Oh, I bet you'll miss them if they do get adopted. Aren't you tempted to keep them? Maybe. If no one wants to adopt them. But the shelter have plenty more cats and kittens for me to foster once these find their forever homes, so it's not like I'll be alone. See? I told you fostering kittens would make you smile again, I saw that. My foster babies were the only thing that kept me going when Brad left me. If I hadn't had them to take care of, I wouldn't have gotten out of bed at all that first week. At least yours still have their mum, mine needed 2 hourly feeds. Worse than human babies, or so I'm told. Anemone forced out a smile. Beth might know about Morgan, but she didn't know about the miscarriage, and Anemone had no desire to tell her about it today. I wouldn't know. She pulled off her lab coat and hung it up. Right, I'm off. See you on Monday. Beth waved, already intent on the flaking paint she was painstakingly restoring once more. Anemone waited for a tour group to pass, then crossed the parade ground to the gatehouse. More tourists milled about in the courtyard, but she weaved through them and headed out, with a wave of farewell to the tour guides at the gate. The markets were in full swing, so she cut through William Street instead of braving the crowds on South Terrace before she headed down High Street home. The barriers were still up, blocking the dug-up road to vehicle traffic, though the footpaths were fine. Full of more people than she was used to seeing too, all enjoying the fine weather and the relaxing of restrictions. Maybe this pandemic really would be over soon, like the news reporters kept saying. She sure hoped so. Anemone trudged upstairs to her apartment, heading straight for the bathroom where she kept the kittens. She cracked open the door, but she wasn't fast enough to catch the dark streak that shot through before she could even get a foot through the door. One look told her who the escapee was, Bruce Wayne, mum to the litter of kittens who remained happily playing in the bathroom. Anemone sighed. Bruce was less than a year old and not much bigger than her 3 surviving kittens. She'd been a stray caught in a quarry before she was brought to the shelter, where her kittens had been born. Unlike her kittens, who were happy to be handled and fine around people, little Bruce wanted nothing to do with them. No one would be adopting Bruce anytime soon, so no matter what happened with the kittens today, Bruce would likely be staying for a while longer. But she could tidy the place up a little. The bathroom had never been so clean, and she was just brushing the kittens one last time when her phone rang. Hello, she said, setting it on speakerphone so she could keep brushing little Clark Kent. Hi, it's Hope from the cat shelter. I just wanted to warn you that we had a lot of interest in your kittens, with more than a dozen people wanting to come meet them. Instead of setting up individual times, I figured it would be easier to run it like a home open, so I brought all their adoption papers and a portable FPOS machine. If I send them up one at a time to see the kittens, would that work for you? Anemone swallowed. Hope would think she was silly if she refused, but this would be the first time she'd had visitors in her new apartment since Morgan died. Well, someone had to be first. Best that it was strangers she would never see again, instead of people who knew her, and would give her long, pitying looks if they saw the boxes of Morgan's stuff that she hadn't been able to unpack. Sure. That sounds fine. Do you want to man the back door, the one to the car park? That way I can leave it unlocked, and when I send the first person down, you can send the next one up. There. A plan. It even sounded like she was in control again, instead of, well, someone who wasn't fit to foster cats. Awesome. Well, I'm in the van in the courtyard, so if you want to come down. The afternoon proceeded as smoothly as a well-oiled machine. Before Anemone knew it, little Peter Parker, Dick Grayson and Clark Kent were on their way to their new homes, where they'd hopefully get more original names than the ones the shelter had doled out, and she had the apartment to herself again. Well, herself and Bruce Wayne, the furry fugitive. Anemone sighed. She'd look for the cat later. Now it was time to prepare something for dinner, and after she'd eaten, then she'd scour the house. She wasn't about to go to sleep with a creature loose in her house, causing who knew what kind of mayhem. 2. Dunstan awoke in darkness, straining his ears for the sound of her. He pushed through pitch until he broke through into gloom, slipping through shadows in search of her. She was here somewhere. She had to be. Not in the basement, where shadows swallowed the silence. Not in the foyer, where the day's dying rays lanced through colored glass windows, staining the floor before they faded. He stepped out onto tiles already chilled from winter's bite. One thing was certain, he would guard his heart this time. Once he'd had the heart of a normal man, capable of love and pain in equal measure, but now he had a heart of stone, impervious to any woman's charms. Footsteps echoed from above. She was upstairs. Dunstan began to ascend. 3. Anemone threw herself down on the couch. She'd searched the place top to bottom twice, and she still couldn't find Bruce Wayne. What if she'd somehow managed to sneak outside? She'd be drenched and cold and probably hiding somewhere, and she'd never hear the end of it from the shelter if she lost a cat. Some foster carer she was. The weather evidently agreed with her, hammering the windows with raindrops so hard they might have been hailstones. Anemone prayed the cat wasn't outside. She wouldn't want her worst enemy out in this. A blood-curdling yowl erupted, only just audible above the rain. Bruce? Anemone called, heading for the stairs. Up or down? Another furious yowl had her breathing a sigh of relief. If Bruce was upstairs, she wasn't outside. The noise grew louder with every step she took, until Anemone stepped into the bathroom Bruce had originally escaped from. Bruce had managed to climb into the kitten enclosure, and she was nosing around it, calling for her lost kittens. Anemone dropped to her knees. I know how you feel, little one. I lost my baby too. You've just got to tell yourself they're in a better place now. Bruce flattened her ears and hissed. All right, I'm not sure I believe it either, but you have to keep going. Remember to eat and sleep and do all the normal things you have to in order to stay alive. Here, let me get you some of the special food I bought. She'd been feeding them the cat biscuits the shelter had provided, but she'd spotted the little individual seafood pouches at the supermarket last week, and somehow they'd ended up in her shopping trolley. It's called saucy seafood morsels, Anemone told the cat as she peeled back the lid and poured the contents into a bowl. It looked like something she might eat, and it didn't smell too bad either. I know food is hardly a replacement for your family, but you have to eat. A chill rippled down Anemone's back. Then a second one. She looked up, just in time to see a fat drop of water disconnect from the ceiling and plop into a growing puddle on the floor. No, the roof couldn't be leaking. Not on a Saturday night in the middle of a storm when no one could come to repair it. She'd have to move the cat to somewhere else. Anemone scooped up the little black ball of fur, which cowered in her arms like she actually trusted Anemone to take care of her. Luckily, Anemone's sweater was too thick for those needle-sharp claws to penetrate, though Bruce dug them in deep. Shall we shift you to the laundry for tonight? Anemone asked. It's dry and warm because I have the dryer on, and I can make up a nice bed for you in the laundry basket. She grabbed the bowl of food. You can eat your dinner in there. The drips came faster now, pattering on the floor almost as hard as the rain outside. The cat squirmed out of her arms and leaped for freedom. No, come back. That's when the world came crashing down. 4. He found her in the bathtub. She rose from her crouch, dust haloing her like an angel as she shook her head and looked up at where the ceiling should be. Then she said a few words that proved she was definitely not an angel. He wasn't even sure what all of them meant. He almost laughed. A lady who could outswear a sailor was not someone to be trifled with. He followed her gaze. Fireworks were going off in the rafters, and two cables that looked for all the world like that telegraph thing he'd once seen spat sparks on the wet floor below as more water cascaded down. Then another shower of plaster came down, dropping the end of one of the cables to the floor with it, as the other swung dangerously low. A yowling ball of fur exploded out of the bathtub and landed on the counter beside him. The little black cat then began to rub her head against the wall, as if she knew he was hiding there. No, Bruce, the woman wailed. One of the cables dangled dangerously close to the cat. He didn't think. He seized the nearest cable, swinging it away from the cat. Sparks sputtered against his skin, but he barely felt them. He tied the two together so they hung well away from the floor and turned to face the woman. Oh my God, how did you? Never mind. I'll go shut the power off. She scrambled out of the bath and set off at a run. She returned a moment later, out of breath and shaking the dust from her hair. That has to be the bravest thing I've ever seen. You could have been killed. You can let go of it now. I've turned the electricity off. He nodded. The cables had stopped sparking, which had to be a good thing. Perhaps it was time to ask questions now. What's electricity? 5. She didn't know who he was or where he'd come from, but Anemone wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. He'd saved her life, so that was one big point in his favor. That already made him a superhero in her eyes. She shone her torch at him, trying to get a better picture of her savior than the one she'd seen through the flickering sparks from the torn power cables. Actually, the first thing her torch beam landed on was Bruce, purring all over the man's feet. Bruce, the cat who didn't like anyone. Well, he couldn't be that bad if Bruce liked him. Anemone felt her shoulders relax almost of their own accord. She took a deep breath and looked closer. Bare toes peeped out of the bottom of his baggy pants, the sort her dad had worn when she was a kid, when those were fashionable, and ridges of muscle just rose up from there. There was something behind him, shadowed by his body, like a sort of cape. Exactly what she'd expect a superhero to wear. She wanted to lift the beam to illuminate his face, but blinding him would be rude. So it was much more acceptable to let the light play across his abs, as she wondered what to say to Batman's younger, better-looking brother. That has to be the bravest thing I've ever seen. You could have been killed. You can let go of it now. I've turned the electricity off. Oh God, now she was babbling. She should be saying thank you, asking him who he was or how he'd gotten in here. "What's electricity?" he asked. Anemone blinked. Was he testing her? Or maybe he had taken a jolt from the wiring and now his brain was fried. It's the flow of charge, in this case carried by electrons through copper wiring. Probably from the coal-fired power station down south, or maybe a gas turbine, seeing as it's nighttime now, so the solar panels won't be producing any more power until morning. Babbling again. He was going to regret saving her in a moment. Any minute now. Someone pounded on the door downstairs. "Anemone? It's Katina from next door. Are you all right?" Bruce bolted at the sound of the neighbor's voice. Anemone reached down and grabbed the cat before she could escape again, wrapping an arm firmly around her as she headed downstairs. She struggled to unlock the door with only one hand. "Give me a moment. I'm trying." Finally, she got the door open. Hi." Up close, Katina looked younger than she remembered, like she was still at university. "I heard you scream and I just came to check to see if you were all right," Katina said. She'd screamed? Instinct surely, for she didn't remember doing it. Oh, no wonder Batman had come to her rescue. Morgan used to say that when she screamed, she sounded like a banshee heralding the death of the human race. Katina would definitely have heard it. What had she asked again? Oh, if she was all right. Fine. But she'd nearly died, what with water and electricity trying to mix on her bathroom floor. Now, anyway. Some of the rain got into the roof, and part of the ceiling in my bathroom collapsed. Water and wiring everywhere. It's all right now though. I've turned the power off at the fuse box. I'll call an electrician in the morning. After I've had a chance to clean up the mess. And finish questioning Batman. She still didn't know how he'd gotten into her house. Anemone blinked. Somehow Bruce had squirmed free, but instead of running like she usually did, she was rubbing against the wall. Purring. Like she'd done in the bathroom just before Batman appeared. She didn't remember Batman being able to walk through walls. Unless that was a special talent reserved for his younger brother. She really needed to get back inside and ask him, now. Anemone mumbled an excuse for the cat's strange behavior, and tried to pick her up. Bruce, being Bruce, was having none of it. She dodged Anemone's hands, darted between Katina's legs, then skidded around and raced back inside Anemone's apartment. Better than racing down the stairs and into the foyer, or worse, into Katina's apartment. It was a miracle the cat was still alive. "Well, let me know if you need help with anything. I'm just across the hall," Katina said, heading back to her place. Anemone nodded, and hurried to close the door before the cat decided to escape again. Once she'd locked the door, she raced up the stairs to the bathroom. "Now I don't mean to sound ungrateful for you saving my life and all, but I have to ask." Anemone began. Only to find that she was talking to herself, for the bathroom was empty. The Batman was gone. Bruce rubbed against her foot, letting out a piteous mew. Now that was a first. "Let's get you some dinner in the laundry, like we were planning before all this happened," Anemone said. She collected what she needed and carried it down the hall. The cat came with her. As the little creature noshed on her second sachet of saucy seafood, Anemone watched her. If she hadn't seen both of them in the same room, she'd almost wonder if it were possible for the cat to shift into a man. Bruce Wayne and Batman were hardly a stretch. But no. "You're not really a Bruce, are you?" "After today, I think I'll call you Lucky," Anemone said. Lucky was too busy slurping her fish to disagree. 6. The sea was all around her, waves swishing against the hull. No one and nothing but water, from horizon to horizon. But she had to find him. She had to, or he'd be lost forever. Lost to the sea, and then she'd be lost too. Anemone woke up with a start. That bloody nightmare again. Why she kept having it when she knew better than to go sailing alone, she didn't know. But still she did what the grief counselor had told her, because it was supposed to help. Somehow. She was home in bed, in a sea of cotton sheets that were soft beneath her questing fingers. She took a deep breath, inhaling the faint scent of the drying lavender in a vase on the dressing table. She switched on the bedside lamp so she could see the room for herself. Only to find Lucky, curled up and purring, at the end of her bed. "I thought I locked you in the laundry," she said to the cat. Evidently not. Either that or the cat could open doors. Oh shit, what if she'd opened the door to the mess in the bathroom and tracked plaster dust all over the house? Anemone padded upstairs, where the floor was mercifully free of dusty paw prints. The laundry door was indeed wide open, explaining Lucky's freedom, but Anemone could have sworn she'd closed the door before she went to bed. Maybe Batman had come back to save the cat from Durant's file. Perhaps he'd mistaken her for Catwoman, and she should have renamed her Selina Kyle instead. No. Batman and all the other superheroes were fictional. She must have imagined the man in her bathroom. Yet when she raised her camping lantern to light up the place, the mess was still just as she remembered it, with the knotted electrical cables tied into a net well clear of the floor. She'd seen him tie those knots, even if she hadn't seen him that clearly. Maybe he was an angel Morgan had sent, for it could not have been Morgan himself. She'd have recognized his voice. God, listen to her. First she was having nightmares about being lost at sea when she never sailed out of sight of shore, and now she was debating whether she'd been visited by a superhero or an angel last night. Maybe she'd gone mad. Mad or not, this mess needed cleaning up, and Anemone knew she wouldn't be getting much more sleep, so she may as well make a start on it. Back to the laundry for some gloves, buckets, stuff for sweeping and another couple of camping lanterns, before she set to work. She carted bucket after bucket of debris outside to the bins until they were full, and still it looked like she'd barely touched the pile. Maybe because the biggest section of intact ceiling still sat there, too big to take outside unless she broke it up or had someone else to help her. Where was Batman when you needed him? In a comic book where he belonged. It was Morgan she wished was here now. He'd have waded in to help, working alongside her until everything was done. Maybe this never would have happened if Morgan was still here. He would have noticed the signs of the impending ceiling collapse, and fixed things before they got this bad. But Morgan was gone and he wasn't coming back, so she'd have to deal with this herself. Grimly, she grabbed the edge of the ceiling panel, and flipped it up so she could move it aside. Anemone propped it up against the wall, then turned back to the much smaller pile of debris that had been hiding underneath it. She dropped to her knees with her dustpan and brush, ready to continue, but the first sweep of her brush uncovered something brown and leathery. She prayed it wasn't the dried corpse of some long-dead rat, and carefully brushed the dust away from it. No, not a rat, this leather had stitches. But it was so tiny. With shaking hands she scooped up her find. It was a child's shoe, so small it might have belonged to a baby or a doll. Like her own baby might have worn if she hadn't lost him. Without warning, she was dropped back into a nightmare, but it wasn't a stormy sea that surrounded her this time. Instead, it was a pool of blood that she couldn't seem to stop flowing, and the pain in her midsection was like she'd been stabbed. A desperate cry clawed its way out of her throat, as she surrendered to what she knew was not only a nightmare, but a memory. 7. His heart might be made of stone, but it took a heartless man indeed not to be moved by the kneeling woman, sobbing her own heart out on the dusty bathroom floor, clutching a child's shoe to her chest. Why his own son might have worn just such a shoe. The memory itched at the back of his mind, but try as he might, he could not recall what his son's face looked like. All he knew was that he had lost him. as she must have lost her child, for who but a mother could cry in such agony? He didn't think. He stepped from the wall and dropped to the floor beside her, before he pulled her into his embrace. She stiffened at first, but then he said, "Cry as much as you need to, miss. There is no shame in a mother's grief." She sniffled. "But I don't need to, that's why it's so silly. I just can't seem to stop." And she cried some more while he held her before she finally stilled. "Will you tell me about him?" he asked. "The child you lost?" But I didn't really know him, or if it was a him at all. I knew I was pregnant, and I was just waiting for the right time to tell my husband, until the night I lost him. Maybe I lifted too many boxes, or maybe I did too much, or maybe there was something wrong with him and he never would have survived the birth. I'll never know, but I went to the bathroom and there was blood everywhere. I don't even remember calling the ambulance, but I must have because Morgan wasn't home. He didn't come home. I woke up in hospital and the police were there to tell me. She dissolved into tears again, sobbing even harder than before. He just held her. It seemed like the right thing to do. When she stilled again, he said softly, "I lost a child once too. I never saw him either. His mother married another man and told him he was his father, and she wouldn't let me see him." He swallowed. He could not remember his son, but he could remember her voice, telling him to leave and not come back. "I can't imagine how much harder it must be for a mother," he finished. She pulled away from him so he could see her face as she shook her head. "No greater than a father's grief. If Morgan had known, if I'd had a chance to tell him, he would have mourned right alongside me. We probably would have tried for another child by now, but..." She wiped her eyes. "What about your son? Where is he now?" He spread his arms wide. "I do not know." He considered how much time had passed since the day he'd discovered he was a father. He did know, though he wished it were not so. "But I believe he died a long time ago." She nodded slowly. "It's not natural for children to die before their parents. Wrong somehow, as though the world had twisted on its axis and could never be the same again." He stared at her. How could this woman read his mind? Was she a witch, or some sort of supernatural creature? She offered him a watery smile. "Did Morgan send you?" He shook his head. He knew no one by that name. She gestured at his wings. "I thought, what with those wings and all, you had to be an angel, and maybe..." He was no angel. That he knew for certain. "I'm not an angel but a gargoyle, miss. The gargoyle protector of this building and those who dwell here." He frowned. If this was true, and he knew it was, then surely he would remember helping her when she'd lost her baby. Yet he had no memory of the night she'd described. No memory of her at all. Her smile turned wistful. "Not an angel and not Batman either." "No, miss, I'm not a Batman. I was a ship's carpenter before." He couldn't recall any of his past, except for the snippets of memory that seemed to rise up like flotsam before sinking again. "Before I became a gargoyle." And are hugs and comforting weeping women normal tasks for a gargoyle? She ducked her head, hiding a smile. "I haven't met a gargoyle before and I'm curious." "Miss..." "No, it was Mrs., wasn't it?" She'd been married. "Mrs. Doctor, actually. Dr. Seaver. I met Morgan when I was doing my PhD and he was so proud when I graduated. But you can call me Anemone if you like. Dr. Seaver is what I make obnoxious men at conferences call me, when they try to correct me on things they know nothing about. You're telling me about gargoyles, which you know far more about than I do, so, Anemone." A soft chirp came from the door, followed by the patter of paws as the little black cat crossed the room to jump onto his outspread wings, resting on the floor behind him. The creature curled into a ball and began purring. "And that's lucky," the woman added. He reached over to stroke the cat. It purred harder. "I'm Dunstan," he said. Dr. Seaver, Anemone, extended her hand like a man would. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Dunstan the gargoyle." Dunstan knew enough of the world to be certain that shaking her hand in a manly fashion was not something he should do. So he leaned over and pressed his lips to the back of her hand instead. He might not be a gentleman, but he knew how they were supposed to behave. "And honor, Anemone." She folded her legs beneath her and gave him her full attention. "Now tell me all about gargoyles."